Welcome to our channel. In today's video, we've gathered 8 true disturbing horror stories that will send chills down your spine. So, sit back and prepare yourself for a journey into the unknown. Before starting these horror stories, please like this video. Tell us in the comments which story you liked and subscribe our YouTube channel for more horror stories. Story number 1. I was heading to my refrigerator when suddenly a loud crash came from outside. I don't know what it was, but going to open the door sent a shiver straight down my spine. I slowly reached for the doorknob when suddenly unbelievable pounding hit the front door, and I fell backwards, landing on my back. The door came flying wide open, and to my surprise, it was Quincy. It seems he tripped and knocked over my plant, causing it to hit the ground and make the crashing sound. Quincy came barging in, telling me on his way here he heard noises coming from the old mansion on Devil's Peak. Before I replied to him, I lifted myself up and took a breather. I told him that's impossible since no one has lived there for years, but he insisted that it was true. I finally asked him what the sounds were. He told me in very specific detail that he heard a lady's scream, a baby's laughter, and a husband's cry, all in that order. At first, I thought about it, then replied to him in a clear statement, "Let's go take a look at that mansion." Having to walk up the hill to Devil's Peak took a lot of energy only because the hill was huge and steep. As we grew nearer to the mansion, I started wondering if Quincy was telling the truth or lying to scare me. Either way, I would get to the bottom of whatever this so-called noise was. We finally reached the top of the hill, and to my surprise, the mansion was bigger than I expected. It was blue with white splattered paint in a few spots, and had a wide double door crafted out of marble and wooden windows, perfectly spread a good 5 feet away from each other. The curtains looked as if they were dusted only 5 minutes before we arrived. The house looked as if it had never been touched. Walking up to the front door, I realized Quincy was still at the top of the hill staring at the mansion. I grabbed him and told him there was nothing to be scared of, and soon afterwards we heard thunder. We both jumped and screamed, then plop! We were on our butts. As we got up and cleaned ourselves off, it started raining, so I advised we go in the mansion until the weather cleared up, and so we did. Walking into the mansion felt comforting and yet disturbing. I noticed there was some polished furniture in what seemed to be the living room. I told Quincy I was going to check it out, and he told me not wander off because there might be ghosts. I told him not to worry and that there were no such thing as ghosts. As soon as I turned around, thud, I smacked my head dead on with a piece of wood hanging from the ceiling. Quincy laughed hysterically to the fact I hit my head. I waited for the pain to go away and ventured into the living room. When I entered the living room, something didn't feel right, nor did it feel bad. But something caught my eye before I thought about these feelings. It was a record player, but it didn't have the usual needle you put on the record. Instead, it had a big tuba-looking thing above it. Quincy came into the room a few minutes later, looking around, and also observed the weird record player. I told him the sound probably came out from the top. My eyes, while scanning the record player, caught a circular shape in the distance, hanging off the side of the table. I walked over to it and grabbed it. Picking up the object, I could tell it was a good 50 years old, at least. Plus, to my surprise, it was a record. The names and songs on the records were scratched and faded, so I couldn't tell what kind of music it was. But I was dying to try it out. Quincy urged me to put it down because the record was delicate and could break and cut me at any time. I told him not to worry as I settled the record on the record player and listened in horror. Quincy and I both gazed at the record player. The record did not play a song, but in its place, a recording of someone's dark, deep voice. The voice sounded depressed, and by the deepness of the voice, it sounded male. Anyway, the voice spoke, and not to itself, but I think us. Yes, it was us. The voice was telling us that we were now trapped, and that the way to get out was to live through 3 events in the past and not only see the events, but feel them. I shut my mouth after the voice stopped talking and thought to myself, this can't be real. I did not just hear a voice from 50 years ago talk to me. While I was troubling with the fact that a voice talked to us, Quincy threw himself at the door, and to our astonishment, it was boarded up. My mouth went wide and I was speechless. We were locked inside by whatever forces kept us here, and then we heard something. I completely lost all thought of anything at the moment, and I'm guessing so did Quincy, because what we heard was phenomenal. It was a lady talking. Then, out of nowhere, shriek. A loud scream came out of all directions and shattered the windows above us by the stairwell. Then I came up with an idea. Whoever is messing with us forgot one important thing: locking the windows, or better yet, making them soundproof. I grabbed Quincy and ran up the stairs, and to my amazement, the windows weren't there anymore. Quincy gazed at the hard, solid wooden wall at where the windows were. I told him not to panic, but nevertheless he went into a panic frenzy, screaming and yelling, "We are going to die." I grabbed him and smacked him, telling him to chill. I had to think, and he wasn't helping. Then something came to me, something important. Didn't Quincy hear a lady scream before we came to the mansion? I ran to Quincy, who was against the wall in fetal position, and asked him what sounds he heard before we came here, and he replied with the very answer I didn't want to hear. He did hear a lady scream. As I dragged Quincy down the empty hallway, we heard it again, but this time clearer. The sound came from the end of the hallway, and so I ran to the other end, leaving Quincy behind, only to find something so horrible and disturbing you would cry. It was a lady, all right, who screamed, a lady with a knife through her back. I gazed in horror as she turned around and screamed, "Help me!" over and over again. If that wasn't enough, she was coming closer. I couldn't move for some reason, and as soon as she was an inch from my torso, Quincy came into the room and yelled, "AL!" Finally, I moved just a second before the lady reached for my shirt, and I fell on my butt. I got up, turned around, and told Quincy to run, but he stared at me, pointing at my shirt. His mouth was wide open and his eyes scarred with fear. His fingers were pointing dead at me. I asked what's wrong, and he muttered something. I couldn't hear him, so I asked again, and this time he didn't need to answer because I felt a cold breeze hit my chest. I looked down and saw my shirt ripped and my chest bleeding. I thought there is no way I could have done that from falling, but from something sharp touching me, or something like fingernails. The lady ripped my shirt, but I was sure she wasn't real. She was an illusion. There was no way she was alive, or was she? Thinking of the lady, I remembered we were still in the room, so I turned around and, to my amazement, she was gone. She disappeared into thin air just like a ghost. No, that's not possible. There are no such things as ghost. Just then we heard another sound. This time it was a baby's laughter. Quincy stared at me, but I already knew why. It was the second sound he heard. Darting ahead of Quincy, I looked back to watch something I wish never happened. Out of nowhere, the ground collapsed under Quincy, and to my horror, I watched my best friend fall into the pits of darkness down below to his death. I tried to jump in, but I didn't have the guts. My best friend was gone. I fell to my knees and started to shed tears. I knew it was my fault. I shouldn't have let him come with me to this place. He died because of my carelessness. I screamed at the top of my lungs and smashed my fist on the ground. After I was done sobbing, I got up, said a few words for him, and started to walk away when I heard something shout from the hole. It couldn't be. It was impossible. But sure enough, the voice was clear enough for me to figure it out. It was Quincy. I rushed back to the hole and screamed his name. A few minutes later, I heard mine. He was alive, but how? I yelled down the hole, "Are you safe?" A few seconds later, he replied, "No, I'm hanging onto a piece of wood sticking out from the wall." I cried happy tears, then realized that he won't be able to hang for long. I jumped up and looked around for something to throw to him, and I saw a curtain. Hey, it works for getting out your window, so why not now? I grabbed the curtain, tying it together to make a line, and shouted to Quincy to hold on. And what made me laugh a little is that he replied saying, "Do I have a choice?" I finished tying the curtain and lifted it down to him and told him to grab it, and so he did. He was heavier than I expected. I used all my strength to pull him up and carry him out of the hole. We sat there for a few minutes catching our breaths, and he finally turned toward me and said with the most compassion I have ever heard, "Thank you." I replied, telling him no problem and that I was glad he was alive, but not long enough for us to hear another noise. I was glad and worried because what we heard was the final sound. A man was crying. Quincy and I got up with newfounded courage and carefully walked toward the sound. We came into a white room filled with paintings of a woman scattered everywhere. They were on the wall, the ground, even the ceiling. We looked around and saw nobody, so we turned around, and then everything went blank. 5 seconds before it went dark, I remembered a black figure standing in front of us, crying, and he whispering what seemed to be, "I am sorry." I started waking up to a bright light. I opened my eyes and started to scream, but I couldn't. I was tied to pole, and to my right, so was Quincy. It seems he was awake and fully aware of the surroundings. It was a blue room with a baby carriage, toys, a work desk, and some knitting tools. I don't know if I was dreaming, but what Quincy and I saw seemed very realistic. A lady walked into the room not noticing us and slammed the door. She turned around and watched a man, probably her husband, dart into the room. They started yelling and fighting. The husband pulled out a knife from his pocket and stabbed the lady in her back. He backed up and watched her fall on the bed. He looked toward the baby's carriage. He picked the baby up and watched as the baby laughed and smiled. He flipped open the carpet he had on the ground and dropped the baby into the hole he had hidden and started to cry then. I woke up on the porch of the mansion and saw that Quincy was starting to gain conscious also. I helped him up and we started to question each other about if what we had just seen was real. We came up with the conclusion that it wasn't real, so we briefly looked at the mansion and started walking home, and then Quincy stopped and stared in horror at my shirt. I asked him what was wrong about it, so I looked down and saw that it was still ripped. Story number 2. It was 10:30 at night. I was riding shotgun in Armand's car, and 3 other friends, 2 guys and 1 girl, were seated behind. We had gone to a resort in the outskirts of town to have dinner and were returning home by the highway. It was a dark, deserted road with no street lights. Inside the car, the 3 friends in the back seat were constantly joking about how creepy the road was and how all of them had heard stories of some ghostly children who kept crossing the streets, running barefoot. I was enthralled by their tales, but didn't quite believe them, for they were too over the top to be true. Armand, though, was quaking in his seat, begging them to stop. I laughed and patted him on the back, ensuring him that they were only joking and there were no such things as ghosts or evil spirits. Just then, as if to prove me wrong, 3 middle-aged men suddenly appeared, walking by the side of the road. For the split second that I saw them, their features were imprinted in my mind. The one on the left was dressed in a maroon cardigan. The one in the center had a yellow turban on his head, and the one on the right had a black shawl wrapped around his shoulders. Their appearance was so sudden that Armand swerved the car violently to avoid hitting them, causing us all to jump in our seats. We crossed them, but shock was tangible inside the car, the laughter of seconds ago reduced to stunned silence. It was too dark to make out where these 3 men came from, but if you were me, you would have sworn they appeared out of thin air. I was in the front seat, constantly keeping an eye out on the road. I would have seen beforehand if 3 men in such distinct clothes were walking right by us. There was no banter now, no more ghost stories. We were too petrified to even make conversation. The girl in the back urged Armand to drive faster so we could reach home soon. My own heart was thumping hard, but I put on a brave visage and turned back to tell them that everything was all right, that those men were probably locals from the nearby village out on a post-dinner walk. Just then, our car swerved violently again, skidding dangerously close to the divider. I turned around, my hand on Armand's shoulder to steady myself, and asked, "What the hell was that?" Armand's fists were gripping the steering wheel tight. His voice came out in barely a whimper. There were 3 men walking by. Those same 3 men we crossed 5 minutes back. I looked at him, my mouth agape in disbelief. No, that can't be, I reasoned. Was the man in the center wearing yellow headgear? Yes, and the one on the left, a maroon jacket. They were the same men, I swear. An irrational fear tightened itself around my heart in a vice-like grip. Finding my voice, I looked at the navigation app on my phone and said, "We have around 1 kilometer of this road ahead of us. Let us all keep our eyes open till we reach home." The highway was filled with potholes, but a terrified Armand drove as fast as he could and crossed the distance within 10 minutes. On the last stretch of the highway, just before the familiar lights of the town came into view, we could spot a single headlight in the distance. I grabbed Armand's wrist in caution as everyone else held their breath, not knowing what to expect. And as we drove closer, we could see a broken-down motorbike by the road. 3 men stood next to it, waving at us, asking us to stop our car and get help. These men were much younger, probably in their 20s, but the one who flagged us down was wearing a maroon cardigan, and the one standing closest to the motorbike had a black shawl thrown carelessly around his shoulders. We didn't stop. None of us uttered a word. Armand stepped on the accelerator and sped past in a whiz. I looked back, terrified that these men might follow us on their bike, but all I saw was the darkness. The headlight that had been flashing just a few seconds ago had disappeared. Where had it gone? Neither Armand, nor I, nor the 3 friends in the back seat breathed until we reached the familiar entrance to the city. It was then that all of us let out a sigh of relief. What was it that had just happened? Who were those 3 men, and what were they trying to tell us? What would have happened had we stopped our car at their behest? I still get goosebumps when I think of that fateful night. Them, and the chills that run down my spine every time the image of those 3 men flashes in my mind, are the only evidence remaining now. Evidence that whatever happened that night was real, and not a figment of my imagination. Story number 3. The sky was overcast with dark clouds. Thunder rumbled now and then with sparks of lightning. Gradually, the soft tapping sound of rain changed to pitter-patter and then to loud drumming. People ran for cover while those who were lucky opened their umbrellas. The puddles began plinking as the rain got heavier. Mihir was carrying an umbrella. Still, the incessant rain had drenched him to his skin. He took shelter under a green wooden structure with a tin roof next to the bus stop. Of the few people who had taken shelter along with him was a man wearing a raincoat, a woman and her child, and a girl of 20. After a while, not seeing a possibility of the rain stopping, the man glanced at his watch and moved out. Then, subsequently, the woman with her child too got into a car that had come for them. Mihir was left alone with the girl. He cast a glance towards her. She was wearing a bright red salwar, which was wet from the rain. She was looking away from him, towards the drizzle. He thought of striking a conversation and said, "It doesn't seem that the rain will stop anytime soon." She did not respond. "Where are you headed?" Mihir asked. At this, the girl looked up, smiled faintly, and answered, "Mother Teresa Sarani." In a word, she was captivating. Kohl highlighted her large almond-shaped eyes, set flawlessly on her pale face, which her long black hair partly concealed. Yet she was frail and was shivering from the cold wind chilling her wet dress. Mihir glanced at his wristwatch. It was 10:30. By now, the rain had slowed down. He thoughtfully asked the girl, "I see you have no umbrella, so if it doesn't bother you, then you may come with me. I am going nearby. I'll drop you in the way." She hesitated for some time, stood up and said, "Only if it is no problem to you." "Yeah, no problem." Mihir and that girl stepped out of the bus stop. There was little space for both of them under the umbrella. She was walking too close to him. He smelled a faint, sweet perfume from her. The raindrops sounded like the tinkling of numerous anklet bells. Mihir thought of breaking the ice and talking to her when she said, "So, hi, I'm Meghna. And you are?" "Mihir." They talked and laughed as they passed by so many closed stores, gloomy houses, deserted lanes, few vehicles zooming past them, and still fewer people walking on, otherwise the busiest streets of Malik Bazaar in this pitch-black night. Mihir was highly elated by walking with this attractive girl in this rain, sharing an umbrella. It seemed like one of those beautiful romantic movies. He pulled her, trying to place his hand on her waist. He peeped towards Meghna. She was quiet and smiling embarrassedly. This intimacy was growing fast. She broke the silence. "Take a right turn shortly. We'll come to my place." Mihir looked around. This place was something familiar. Mother Teresa Sarani? Meghna was breathing excitedly and smiling. As they turned right after a while, realization dawned upon Mihir as his eyes caught the gate on top of which was written South Park Street Cemetery. Mihir, startled, stopped abruptly. But Meghna, having spotted him, aggressively dragged him toward the cemetery. He had gathered around him a thick, dense fog. He couldn't see the way forward. However, the supernatural force pulled him forward. He went on and let himself be pulled on his hand by the seizure. All of a sudden, the fog smoothed out and revealed a grave before him. It took a moment for Mihir to get out from the daze, and he was petrified by what he saw ahead. He was frozen to death. On the gravestone was inscribed, Meghna Matthews, July 6, 1996, November 19, 2016. In front of the gravestone was a large 6 feet deep pit, but it lay bare, and a foul, rotting stench of flesh wafted from it. 19 November 2016. Yes, Mihir could now hit his senses. That fateful night like this when he had killed someone. No, not intentionally. It was an accident. He was high after that late-night party and was racing his car with his friends when suddenly a girl came before him. He tried hard to pull the brakes, but before the very eyes of him, the car skidded, hit the girl, and hurled her into the air. All he could see of the girl was that she was wearing a red salwar before she let out a heart-wrenching scream, and then his car's windshield was covered with blood. Mihir thought of taking her to the hospital, but he feared that she might be dead, and from that day, that scene had haunted him. But tonight, that girl had come to seek her vengeance. That girl was no more a human. She was hovering a few inches above the ground. He could see her pale face in full sight now. There was a large gaping hole in her skull, from where an endless amount of blood was still flowing, smearing her face dark red. She swooped to him and said dismally, "Mihir, you could have saved me." And just then she let out a blood-curdling, malicious laugh and shoved him into the pit. Story number 4. The train was moving through the countryside at a steady pace. It was late at night and most of the passengers were asleep. The only sound was the rhythmic clacking of the wheels on the tracks. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and the train shuddered to a halt. The lights flickered and the passengers were thrown from their seats. They looked around, confused and frightened, as they tried to figure out what had happened. The conductor rushed down the aisle, a look of panic on his face. He told the passengers that they had hit something on the tracks, but he wasn't sure what. He promised to investigate and let them know what was happening. As the conductor left, the passengers sat in silence, waiting for news. But the silence was soon broken by the sound of footsteps on the roof of the train. They sounded heavy and uneven, like someone or something was walking across the metal roof. The passengers looked at each other in fear, wondering what could be making the sound. Suddenly, the door to one of the cabins burst open, and a young woman stumbled out. She was pale and shaking, and her eyes were wide with terror. "There's someone in my cabin," she whispered. "I saw him in the window." The other passengers tried to calm her down, but they too were beginning to feel uneasy. They had heard stories of ghosts on trains, but they had never believed them until now. As they sat in silence, waiting for the conductor to return, they heard more noises on the roof. This time it sounded like something was scratching at the metal. The passengers looked up, but they couldn't see anything in the darkness outside. Just then, the lights flickered again, and the train lurched forward. The passengers were thrown from their seats once more, and they could hear the sound of metal scraping against metal. They realized with horror that the train was moving again, even though the conductor hadn't returned. They tried to open the doors, but they were stuck fast. They were trapped on the train with no way to escape. As they sat in the darkness, they heard the sound of footsteps again, this time coming from inside the train. They were getting closer, and the passengers could feel their hearts pounding in their chests. Suddenly, the door to the cabin burst open, and a figure stepped out. It was a man dressed in old-fashioned clothing, with a pale face and dark eyes. He looked around the carriage, his eyes fixed on the passengers. One by one, he approached them, his hand outstretched. The passengers tried to move away, but they were paralyzed with fear. The man touched each of them lightly on the forehead, and then he vanished into thin air. The passengers were left alone in the darkness, with no idea of what had just happened. They tried to stay calm, but their nerves were frayed. They had no idea what was going to happen next. Suddenly, the train shuddered to a halt again. The lights flickered and then went out completely. The passengers were plunged into darkness, with only the sound of their breathing to keep them company. And then, from somewhere outside the train, they heard the sound of laughter. It was high-pitched and mocking, and it sent chills down their spines. The laughter grew louder and louder until it filled the carriage. The passengers huddled together, praying for the train to start moving again. But it never did. They were trapped on the train, with no way to escape the ghostly presence that had taken over. The passengers were never seen again. Some say that they were trapped on the train forever, doomed to ride through the darkness for all eternity. Others say that they were taken. Some say that they were taken by the ghostly presence, dragged off the train and into the night. And there are those who say that they never even existed, that the train and its passengers were nothing more than a ghostly apparition, a figment of the imagination. But one thing is certain: the train is still out there, haunting the countryside with its ghostly presence. And those who hear the sound of its whistle in the night know to stay far away, lest they become its next victims. Story number 5. The desert wind whipped through the cracked glass windows of the gas station, a mournful dirge that seemed to echo the desolate expanse of the Nevada highway. It was the kind of place where the only company a night shift attendant could expect was the ghostly glow of the neon signs and the intermittent hum of passing cars. For Jake Harris, this was more than just a job. It was a refuge from the relentless city life, from the noise, the crowds, and the expectations. Out here, in the heart of the barren desert, he found a solitude that was both comforting and isolating. The night was young, and the station was empty. The only sound, apart from the wind, was the rhythmic ticking of the old clock on the wall. A creature of habit, Jake had settled into a routine. A cup of coffee, a worn paperback, and the occasional customer who broke the monotony of the night. Then it happened. A car pulled up to the pump with a screech of tires that seemed to echo through the silence. The driver, a man cloaked in shadow, stepped out. His face was obscured by the brim of a worn-out hat, and his eyes, when they met Jake's, seemed to hold an ancient, unsettling depth. "Fill her up," the man said, his voice a gravelly whisper. Jake nodded, his mind racing. There was something off about this man, an aura of wrongness that clung to him like a shroud. As he filled the tank, the man's eyes never left him, a cold, unwavering gaze that made Jake's skin crawl. When he finished, the man paid in cash, his hands trembling slightly as he passed the bills. As he turned to leave, he paused, his back to Jake. Then, slowly, deliberately, he turned around. His face was no longer human. Where his eyes should have been were two empty black sockets, and his mouth stretched into a grotesque, inhuman grin. Terror seized Jake. He stumbled backward, his mind racing. The man lunged, his inhuman speed a blur. Jake turned and ran, the bell above the door jingling frantically as he burst out into the night. The desert wind whipped at his face, a cold, biting sting against his skin. He ran blindly, his heart pounding in his ears. Behind him, he could hear the man's inhuman howls, growing louder with each passing second. He stumbled and fell, scraping his knees on the rough asphalt. But he dared not stop. He had to keep moving, to put as much distance as possible between himself and that creature. The first rays of dawn were beginning to paint the sky with hues of pink and orange when he finally collapsed, exhausted and terrified. He lay there, gasping for breath, his body trembling uncontrollably. He didn't know how long he had been running or how far he had come. All he knew was that he had to survive. When he finally managed to stand, he looked back at the gas station. It was still there, a lonely outpost in the vast expanse of the desert. But something was different. The lights were out, and an eerie silence hung over the place. He realized then that he had probably seen the last of that gas station, and perhaps the last of humanity for a long time. The creature, whatever it was, had claimed that place as its own. And Jake had become a witness, a survivor of a night that would haunt his dreams for the rest of his life. As the sun rose higher, casting its warm embrace over the desert, Jake began to walk. He had no idea where he was going, but he knew one thing for certain. He could never go back. The creature of the night had marked him, and he would carry the scars of that encounter forever. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but he was determined to survive. After all, he had faced the unimaginable and lived to tell the tale. Story number 6. It was a bright and sunny morning as the students of Greenwood High boarded the bus for their annual school trip. Excitement buzzed in the air as they chatted about the adventures awaiting them at the old, historic mansion where they were headed. The mansion, known as Greystone Manor, was infamous for its eerie past. Legends told of mysterious disappearances and unexplained phenomena that had plagued the mansion for centuries. Despite the warnings, the students, eager for a thrill, were determined to explore every corner. Upon arrival, the grandeur of the mansion was overshadowed by its haunting atmosphere. The massive ivy-clad walls and creaking gates seemed to whisper secrets of the past. The caretaker, an old man with a weathered face, greeted them with a stern warning. Stay together and never venture into the West Wing. Ignoring his advice, a group of friends, Alice, Ben, Chloe, and David, decided to explore the forbidden West Wing after dark. Armed with flashlights and a sense of bravado, they sneaked out of their rooms and made their way through the dimly lit corridors. As they entered the West Wing, the temperature dropped noticeably. The air grew thick with a musty odor, and their flashlights flickered. Suddenly, they heard faint whispers echoing through the halls. Alice, trying to mask her fear, joked, "Must be the wind playing tricks on us." They continued deeper into the wing, stumbling upon an old, dusty library. The room was filled with ancient books and cobwebs. On the center table lay a leather-bound journal. Ben, curious, picked it up and began to read aloud. The journal detailed the life of a man named Edmund, the original owner of Greystone Manor, who was rumored to have dabbled in dark arts. As Ben read, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. Chloe, feeling uneasy, urged them to leave, but David insisted on exploring further. They moved to a hidden staircase leading to the basement. The air became suffocatingly heavy as they descended. In the basement, they found a room lined with mirrors. Each mirror seemed to reflect not only their images, but also shadowy figures lurking behind them. Panic set in as they realized they were not alone. The shadows moved closer and the whispers turned into anguished cries. Desperate to escape, they ran back up the stairs, only to find the door locked. The mansion seemed to be playing tricks on them, its layout shifting and changing. Their flashlights flickered and died, plunging them into darkness. In the pitch black, they clung to each other, their breaths shallow and quick. Suddenly, the whispers turned into a deafening roar, and the shadows engulfed them. They felt in unbearable pain, as if their very souls were being torn apart. Just as quickly as it had started, the noise stopped. The students found themselves back in their rooms, the morning light filtering through the windows. Dazed and disoriented, they wondered if it had all been a nightmare. But the haunted look in each other's eyes confirmed that what they had experienced was all too real. As they boarded the bus to leave Greystone Manor, the caretaker watched them with a knowing look. "Remember," he said, "some places are meant to remain untouched. You were lucky to return." The students left with more than just memories of a school trip. They carried with them the scars of a night spent in the grip of true horror, a night that bonded them in fear and left an indelible mark on their souls. Story number 7. I glance at the wedding invitation on my desk one last time before hearing Vanessa buzz at the door. My girlfriend had invited me to one of her distant cousin's big white wedding at a grand estate or whatnot, tucked away in the picturesque Kent. "I'm coming," I call out, locking the door behind me. "There's no rush, we still have some time before it starts," Vanessa reassures me with a smile. "You look great, by the way. Lovely dress." We slide into the back of the cab. The drive to the venue takes about 40 minutes, but it flies by a lot quicker. The landscape of lush green fields and forests takes my breath away with the sunlight casting a golden tint over everything. Vanessa sits beside me close enough that our knees touch. She taps a rhythmic pattern on her thigh, a habit she has when she's nervous. I can't help but smile and take her hands in my lap. "You look beautiful," I whisper, though the hum of the engine seems to suck away my words. She glances at me and smiles, her eyes glistening in the warm sunlight. "Thanks," she replies, her voice light, almost teasing. "But you're the one turning heads in that dress." I feel a warmth spread through me, a blush creeping up my neck, but I turn my head to hide it, focusing on the passing trees. The cab eventually turns down a long driveway, flanked by towering oaks that seem to whisper secrets from the past. At the end of the drive, Rosewood Hall appears like a dream, a majestic estate draped in ivy, with turrets and tall windows that sparkle in the afternoon light. As we step out of the cab, I straighten my dress and take a deep breath, trying to calm the flutter of excitement and anxiety in my chest. Vanessa's hand finds mine, her fingers interlocking with mine in a comforting gesture. "Here we are," Vanessa says, her eyes sparkling with a mix of excitement and relief. We walk towards the grand entrance where guests are mingling, the air filled with the sounds of laughter and clinking glasses. Vanessa leads me to a group near the entrance where Melly, her cousin, stands waiting with a warm smile. "Leah, this is Melly," Vanessa introduces, her voice carrying a note of pride. "Melly, this is Leah, my +1. Melly steps forward, her eyes bright with a welcoming charm. "It's so lovely to finally meet you, Leah," she says, her tone genuine and warm. "I've heard so much about you." "It's wonderful to meet you too, Melly," I reply, offering a smile that I hope conveys my eagerness. Vanessa gives me a reassuring glance before Melly gently takes my hand, leading us into the heart of the celebration. The inside of Rosewood Hall is just as enchanting as the outside, with elegant decor and the soft hum of conversation filling the air. Vanessa and I follow Melly into the main hall, where we are greeted with friendly faces and glasses of champagne, the perfect start to an evening of celebration. The romance of the evening enveloped me, a warm cloak against the cool breeze of Kent. Vanessa and I moved through the crowd, laughter and conversation swirling around us like confetti. The grandeur of Rosewood Hall, with its twinkling lights and elegant decor, seemed to dance in time with the music. Vanessa's hand brushed against mine occasionally, a subtle but electrifying touch that made me feel connected to her in a way that words couldn't express. As the night deepened, I felt a gentle tug of curiosity pull me away from the bustling main event. Vanessa noticed my distracted gaze and leaned closer, her lips near my ear. "You okay?" she asked, her voice soft and concerned. I nodded, smiling up at her. "Just exploring a bit," I replied. "I'll be back soon." With a playful wink, she squeezed my hand. "Don't get lost. I'll be waiting for you." I made my way through the maze of hallways, my footsteps echoing softly on the polished marble floors. The mansion's vastness was both enchanting and overwhelming, and I was drawn to the quieter corners of the estate. After a few twists and turns, I discovered a slightly ajar door leading to a library. The room inside was a serene contrast to the festivities. The scent of aged paper and leather filled the air, and a single lamp cast a muted glow over the room's dark wooden shelves. My eyes were immediately drawn to an oak desk in the center, where an ancient book lay open. Curiosity beckoned me closer. The book's pages were filled with elaborate illustrations and dense, archaic text. The illustrations depicted ritualistic symbols and ceremonies, their significance unclear but undeniably intriguing. My heart quickened as I skimmed through descriptions of ceremonial rites and offerings, strange customs that felt oddly out of place in the mansion's elegant surroundings. Despite the eerie feel of the book's contents, I shook off the unsettling sensation. It was likely just a relic of the mansion's storied history, I reassured myself. With one last glance at the mysterious text, I closed the book and slipped it back into place. Rejoining the party, I let the warmth of the evening wash over me again. Vanessa spotted me from across the room and made her way over with a radiant smile. She slipped her arm through mine, and together we swirled back into the vibrant celebration. The guests danced beneath the canopy of stars, their joy infectious. Vanessa leaned in, her breath warm against my ear. "I missed you," she whispered, her eyes dancing with affection. I smiled, feeling the earlier unease melt away as we lost ourselves in the music and laughter. The night was alive, and in that moment, surrounded by the celebration and Vanessa's presence, I felt completely at ease. As midnight approached, a subtle transformation enveloped Rosewood Hall. The music, once vibrant with carefree joy, softened into a muted melody, and an eerie hush descended upon the guests. They moved with an almost ritualistic precision, their earlier mirth replaced by a synchronized calm. Melly, who had once shimmered with radiant charm, withdrew from the celebration, drawing a following towards a secluded part of the estate. My heart raced as I trailed the procession through the winding corridors of the mansion. The festive lights and laughter faded behind me, replaced by a growing sense of foreboding. Each step felt heavier, as if the mansion itself was conspiring to keep me from discovering its secrets. We arrived at a large, dimly lit room that seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy. Candles were meticulously arranged in intricate, arcane patterns on the floor. Their flames flickered in a disjointed, almost sentient dance, casting ghostly shadows that leaped and twisted across the walls. The dim light revealed symbols etched into the floor, ancient runes that seemed to writhe and shift, their glow eerily reflecting the flicker of the candles. The guests, now cloaked in ceremonial robes of deep, shadowy hues, formed a somber circle around a central altar. Their robes, made of heavy, dark fabric, moved with an unsettling fluidity. The hoods obscured their faces, rendering them faceless specters in the gloom. They moved with a hypnotic precision, their every gesture and step synchronized in a chilling display of ritualistic choreography. Melly stood at the heart of the gathering, her presence commanding and almost otherworldly. She held a ceremonial dagger aloft, its blade catching the dim light and reflecting an ominous sheen. Her eyes, previously detached and aloof, were now fixed with an intense, trance-like focus on the altar. The altar itself was a crude slab, adorned with dark, intricate carvings that seemed to pulse with the room's sinister energy. The guests chanted in a deep, guttural rhythm, their voices merging into a low, resonant drone that seemed to vibrate through the very fabric of the room. The chant was both primal and alien, a haunting, hypnotic melody that rose and fell in waves of dark power. Each chant wove seamlessly into the next, creating a growing intensity that seemed to thrum with an ancient, malevolent force. The symbols on the floor began to glow with an eerie, unnatural light, casting long, shifting shadows that danced and twisted with a malevolent grace. The air grew colder, and the oppressive atmosphere thickened as the ritual reached its ominous climax. The ceremonial gestures of the participants were deliberate and precise, each movement a crucial component of the grim rite. In that moment, as my eyes swept over the disturbing scene, a horrifying realization struck me. The ritual before me was a chilling mirror of the imagery I had seen in the library, the symbols etched into the floor, the dark robes, the ceremonial dagger, and the rhythmic chants. They all matched the grotesque illustrations and archaic text I had encountered earlier. The realization was a shuddering jolt. The very rite I had dismissed as a relic was unfolding before me in its full, terrifying reality. Despair tightened in my chest as I watched the ritual unfold. The mansion, once a symbol of grandeur, now felt like a mausoleum of ancient darkness. Each detail of the ceremony pressed down on me with an almost physical weight, trapping me in this nightmarish tableau. The flickering candlelight seemed to mock the safety I had once taken for granted. In the midst of this encroaching dread, the thought of Vanessa became my beacon of hope. Desperation drove me to retrace my steps through the twisting corridors, my heart pounding with the urgency of finding her. The shadows seemed to close in, whispering with a sentient malice that threatened to overwhelm me. Then, amidst the crushing darkness, Vanessa's voice cut through the silence like a lifeline. "Leah!" Her cry was filled with anguish that mirrored my own. "I was calling for you. Even if I were mute and you deaf, I knew you'd hear me." Her words were a soothing balm to my frayed nerves. I reached out and grasped her hand, our fingers intertwining with a profound sense of relief. "Vanessa," I whispered, my voice trembling with emotion. "Even in this darkness, I would recognize you. Across lifetimes, in different forms and eras, I would always find you." Her eyes, wide with a mixture of fear and relief, met mine. "We need to get out of here," she said firmly, her voice carrying the weight of our shared ordeal. "We've escaped the worst of it. Let's find our way back to the light." With renewed determination, we navigated the maze-like corridors of the mansion together. The oppressive shadows and eerie whispers began to recede as we moved. Each step away from the ritual felt like a victory, the suffocating atmosphere of the mansion lifting with every stride. Emerging into the cool night air, the mansion's dark silhouette loomed behind us, a sinister reminder of the horrors we had left behind. The stars above were a brilliant tapestry of light, each one a silent witness to our harrowing journey and our escape from the clutches of ancient malevolence. Vanessa turned to me, her face illuminated by the starlight. "We're free," she said softly, her voice carrying the weight of our shared ordeal. "We've left it behind." I nodded. the relief in my heart mingling with a profound sense of love and gratitude. "Yes," I replied, "we are free. My love for you is eternal, enduring until the very last star in the sky burns out into oblivion." Hand in hand, we walked away from Rosewood Hall. The night air was cool against our skin, a soothing contrast to the oppressive atmosphere we had left behind. The stars above, now a shimmering backdrop to our escape, seemed to burn with a renewed brilliance. In the quiet of the night, amidst the serene beauty of the cosmos, we found solace in each other's presence, a promise of endless love beyond the darkness. Story number 8. It was dark inside the teapot. Crowded, too. Cast iron walls created a cavernous chamber that was both loud and cold. Around him, Smith sensed an endless sea of sticky flesh. It should have been warm, all those bare bodies, but instead it felt clammy like a feverish chill. It made Smith's skin crawl, made him retract and contort and twist. No matter how he flinched, there was only more cold, sweating flesh. And without his vision, that was all there was. That and the screaming. The screaming echoed, vibrated through his teeth, filling his cavities with an aching symphony. The flesh was yelling, "What's going on? Where are we? Let us out of here," while knuckles and fists broke against the impenetrable walls. Smith's heartbeat throbbed behind his eyes, and his breath roared from his quivering lips. There was more than fear in this dungeon. Like a nightmare, confusion fueled their terror. Smith was disoriented, but he clearly wasn't the only one. Despite the darkness, he closed his eyes and gasped for air, swallowing it greedily. He knew panic was dangerous. He had to calm down. What was happening? Wasn't he just eating dinner with Jasmine? Weren't they just joking about the silent couple beside them as they twirled Alfredo-sauced linguine in quick, tight circles around their forks? He'd noticed the shadowy figures in his peripheral vision, stepping out from the alley that lined the back of the restaurant patio. He remembered how quickly he dismissed them, cataloged them in a part of his brain where they were unimportant. Passers-by, like everybody else. Jasmine was important. She was so beautiful in those pearl earrings, in his favorite dark wine lipstick, in the ambient glow of outdoor string lights. What a blissful moment of naivete. What joy in anticipating his next bite of $36 house-made pasta. It had been a day, no, a week, at work. He deserved it. They arrived at their tables so quickly, grabbed him even quicker. 3 of them surrounding him from left to right, behind him, their hands securing his torso with a frightening firmness. There was hardly time for reaction. Jasmine barely stood, barely uttered a spurn sound or demand for his release. He was taken before anyone could object, gone before suspicion. It was unclear what happened once they turned the corner down that alley. Smith remembered his shoulder blades cinching together, his back made concave by the shock of whatever their infliction. He remembered falling, but not to his knees, not forward towards the floor. The world around him grew larger, escaped him like he'd dropped into a spiraling tunnel. Suddenly, he was like a pebble nestled in a groove of the concrete. Disorientation anchored him to his humanity, told him he wasn't dead, but refused to tell him more than that. Then, there was the teapot. It appeared in front of him like a redwood, majestic and ginormous. Its landing was as loud and turbulent as an earthquake. Covering his ears, he watched the hand of a giant open the teapot's lid. A crushing grip lifted him from behind, and as he hovered above the mountainous kettle, all he could think about was Alice and her rabbit hole. At least she'd chosen to drink from the bottle. At least her bottle gave warning. At least... "It's not a dream." Smith heard the voice clearly. It brought him out of his nightmarish memory and back to the nightmare. The chaotic symphony of screams around him faded. His ears reached out and he looked frantically in all directions as the bodies around him morphed, bumped and undulated at his sides. He pushed back against them now, gripping arms, forcing the contact to be intentional, straining his eyes as he searched for the voice's owner. It had to be close. One woman gripped him back, shrieking, "My children! Where are my children?" Another whimpered, begging with a quivering jaw, I'll be good, just let us go." A man shoved him. "Get your fucking hands off me." The force of it sent him stumbling backwards through the sea of hysterical flesh, and as he regained his balance, Smith sensed something strange in the crowd, a stillness that didn't belong. A bearded old man staring directly at him. They locked eyes, ignoring the panicked bodies passing between them. Smith felt his eyes adjusting, the details unraveling slowly. The man was sweating, dirt smeared across his cheeks and chest. His beard was peppered with graying hairs. His hair was mangled and overgrown. His eyes were gray, like distant clouds rolling in. Smith reached his hand out. "Hey, man, what did you—" "It's not a dream," he repeated. When Smith made contact, a firm grip on the man's wrist, he felt an overwhelming comfort. There was relief in their connection, relief in how the man didn't pull or push away. "Do you know what's going on?" "Where are we?" Smith breathed. "We're in the teapot," the man said. "What? How? What does that even mean? How is that even possible?" Smith was so distraught he couldn't even ask the question that mattered most. The man broke from Smith's grip and pointed to himself, then to Smith. Then he flipped one palm face up, hovered the other over it, and slowly lowered the top towards the bottom. They made us small. So he hadn't imagined it. Smith glanced around as if seeing it would make it easier to believe. All these people, terrified, miniaturized, trapped. What is this? What is happening? What are they going to do with us? Miming along, the man sang, "When I get all steamed up, hear me shout. Tip me over and pour me out." A mad craze filled his eyes as he giggled, pouring out his imagining kettle. His smile was eerie, made Smith shiver. He couldn't look away from the madness blooming in the man's eyes, his smile, his shaggy hair, his convulsing body. He was a mad scientist, a prisoner isolated for too long, a psychopath off their medication. And then he wasn't. In a split second, the madness disappeared. His body stilled, his smile straightened, and his gaze fixed back on Smith, a light of sanity blinking back at him. "It's some kind of punishment. They're trying to punish us," the man said flatly. "Punish us for what?" Bodies pushed against the man, and he absorbed their impact without resistance, swaying all with the current. "All of these people have done something they don't like. You must have too." Jasmine's face flickered in his mind. Her olive eyes shimmered gold the night he told her he loved her. She didn't have to say it back. She just batted her eyes, and he knew. Then the darkness that spread through them when he told her what he did for a living, a hardened shade of green that reminded him of clovers. Smith had prayed they would bring him enough luck to keep her from leaving. Who are they? How did they find us? What kind of punishment? Smith demanded, his volume rising. Around him, the bodies roared. Punishment! They're going to kill us. No, no, no. I have to get out of here. I'm claustrophobic. The heavy breathing remained asynchronous, the screaming disjointed. Smith stumbled at their sound, but the man remained unflinching. "Tell me, Smith, do you believe in right and wrong? What? Do you think things in life tend to be black and white, or do you find yourself operating in gray areas?" The man continued, arching his eyebrows. The question struck Smith with more force than the flesh around him, more powerful than the ocean. "Nothing you tell me can change how I feel about you," Jasmine had said, her soft hands squeezing his hands. She was so gentle. He couldn't stop thinking about how fragile she was, how much he loved her but didn't deserve her. What would he do without those olive eyes? "I help people," he'd began. He'd never told anyone he cared about, but he'd practiced. She'd laughed, stroked the stubble on his cheek. Of course you do. You're such a sweet man." Smith had wanted to curl into her palm, but his body reacted first, gripping her wrist and pulling it from his face. "No," he'd said. "I'm not." It was the first time he'd pulled away from her. She was shocked, but before she could object, Smith added, "I'm capable of things other people aren't." Visibly nervous, Jasmine pulled back. Her retraction was slight, but Smith felt the distance in miles. "I help people die," Smith uttered the final word breathily. The D sound was hard, spoken through clenched teeth, but the rest of the word faded, as if he'd killed that too. For a moment, neither of them took in air. Instead, they stared, listening to each other's heartbeats, like spaceships taking off in different directions, and Smith watched as the clovers snuffed out Jasmine's olives, bringing a cold, dark winter with them. The man's laughter folded around Smith like a sheet of snow. "I mean, children, Smith. Did no one teach you that killing children is wrong? What could be more black and white than that?" The familiar feeling of guilt exploded out of him. "It's what they wanted. I was just trying to help them. Doctors are the ones who should be helping them, not you." The man chuckled like Smith's justification was the punchline to some hilarious joke. For the first time in the teapot, Smith's body felt hot. The miniaturization, the naked flesh, the shadowy figures, none of it scared him as much as the truth of his own life. All those children were going to die anyways. All those families, they had asked for his help. But those facts never, not once, made it feel right. With a loud, reverberating thud, the dungeon shook. The bodies crashed into each other and screams filled the chamber again. The teapot had been set down. "So what?" he yelled. "All of these people are like me. Killers." The man shrugged. "Not all of them. Some of them found other gray areas to work from, loopholes that assisted their immoral activities. All of them deserving of this." He widened his arms, though there wasn't much space for them to open. At least, according to them. Smith tried to look around at all these people like him who'd existed out in the world that he'd never known. People like him who'd carried dark secrets close to their hearts, survived on faulty righteousness and poorly sculpted justifications, and were eaten alive by their own guilt every time the sun moved. He wished he could see their faces. He wished this wasn't how they were meeting. His mind raced, trying to piece together and process what little he knew, filing through his most guarded memories for more answers. "Wait, how do you know my name?" The man's laughter hummed in the darkness. Just then, a woman grabbed Smith's elbows and pulled him close. "Help me, help! You have to help me get out of here!" "Be careful what you wish for," the man warned. "What makes you think it's going to be better out there and not worse?" As he said it, he pointed up. Smith followed his gesture, tilting his head backwards. There was more darkness above him, but a small stream of light shone through the pot's steam hole. Then the ceiling broke open, and a brightness filled the pot. The lid had been removed. Some gasped, "Heaven!" Some cheered. Others shrieked, just as terrified about leaving the pot as they'd been about entering it. Smith shielded his eyes. The woman beside him was muttering a prayer under her breath, squeezing his arm tighter. "What are they going to do to us?" Smith shot at the man. "How do you know so much?" The teapot jolted, and the feeling of rising followed. The man had started singing maniacally again. "I'm a little teapot, short and stout," amidst all the noise of panic. Then the teapot was a cruise ship in cruel waters, flinging the crowd towards the wall as it tipped on its side. They were getting dumped. They were pouring the tea. The question was, where were they getting poured? And what was going to happen to them once they were out of the teapot? Somewhere in the chaos of screaming bodies being thrown into and above and around him, Smith heard splashing. There was a body of water somewhere. Would it be hot? Would it be cold? Would it sting like acid or burn like lava? As Smith slid closer to the opening, the adrenaline numbed him against the scratching and digging of fingernails and jaws clamping down. He felt the teapot shaking furiously, heard the boom, boom, boom of a hand patting down hard on the bottom of the kettle. He was sliding faster now. There were less and less limbs to hold onto. His freefall felt like hours. He surveyed the new space with re-established vision. Around him were boulders, huge behemoth-like rocks with small holes along their surface. It reminded him of pumice stone or lava rocks. Below him was a body of water. It looked fresh, and judging by those who'd already made it there, it seemed as harmless as fresh water. There was screaming, but they were screams of terror, not pain. Smith wouldn't have noticed the caves if everyone had not been swimming towards them. Why were they swimming so fast? His answer fell from the skies. Bright flashes of lights flew towards the water's surface like fireballs, and when he looked up, he saw where they were coming from. Atop the large boulders were armed guards. They held long staffs that they pointed down towards the water. Each flash of light was accompanied by a zap, zap, zap. Each zap that made contact made its target disappear into a spark of white. When Smith landed, his body instantly responded, his arms striking the water repeatedly, his legs kicking fiercely, his mouth spewing out gulps it didn't mean to take. His body tried to be faster, tried to fight through the turbulence. He saw the end of the cave in the distance, and for some reason, it felt like the end zone, a safe place. He imagined Jasmine standing there, waiting for him. He pushed himself forward. Water splashed violently in all directions, lights sparked, and screams were being silenced all around, but he didn't stop. The back of the cave was a blur. As it got closer, the only thing that became clearer was that his vision was becoming more obscured by water slapping over his back, by the encroaching darkness, by the intensifying echoes. A war zone of pure chaos. Smith reached out for the wall, not caring when it broke his skin. He pressed his face into it, breathing heavily. He'd made it. As others joined him, he realized this wasn't the end. There were still flashes of light. The cries were increasing. There was nowhere else for them to go, no hope of safety. This must have been how his clients had felt when they reached out to him, defeated, petrified, trapped with nowhere to go. The person beside him, Smith recognized as the woman in the teapot who'd asked for his help. She was whimpering, sobbing. They gravitated towards each other. He wrapped his arms around her. He wondered what she'd done to deserve this. If you'd let the children die how they were meant to, we would have granted you the same fate, Smith. Smith turned at the sound of the man's voice, expecting to find him in the water with them. But when he located him, the man was standing on a landing in the cave's far corner. He was wearing a guard's uniform, wielding a staff. "Is this not clear enough for you?" the man yelled, spreading his arms wide. "No bad deed goes unpunished. You should know that. Now, let's spread a little light into that darkness." He pointed the staff directly at Smith. The woman ducked her head into Smith's chest and he squeezed her tighter. It felt vaguely familiar, foreign too, all those long embraces he watched parents take after his work was done. They had each other to hold, to mourn with. But until he'd told Jasmine the truth, he'd never had anyone to fold into. Smith stared the guard's staff head on, trembling with anticipation. Here he was, afraid, desperate, and vulnerable, at his life's own end, yet the guard's eyes were fervently ablaze. Smith wondered if the same fervency was seen in his eyes as he pulled the plug on those children, couldn't bear the thought that even a hint of it was visible. He squeezed them tightly shut, focused on his final heartbeats, his spaceship taking off. Smith didn't know where he'd go once the staff went off, but he sensed that he would never get to recommend the best house-made pasta he'd ever had in his life. Never get to say, "It's worth the money." He'd never get to kiss Jasmine's bare skin again, and thank her 1,000 more times for staying with a man she had to relearn to love. He thought of all the parents who hadn't received the worst news of their lives yet, how he'd never touched their broken hearts, wondered if it was for the best. Smith thought of all those bound pages sitting on shelves, assuring the world that Alice did make it out of her rabbit hole, only to discover she'd dreamt the entire thing. In the arms of a stranger, Smith heard Jasmine whispering the words she'd used to console him, like a mother reading the end of a story to her child. "You're still a good person." And as the first zap sounded, Smith almost, for a moment, believed them. Our horror stories are over. Please like this video and subscribe to my YouTube channel for more horror stories. Thanks for watching.